there's a special kind of fear that creeps in when someone simply vanishes. Not when they're kidnapped in front of witnesses, not when there's a struggle or a body or even a clue. I'm talking about the kind of disappearance that defies reason, where a person is there 1 second and the next, they're gone. No signs of violence, no tracks, no evidence they were ever there at all. Just an empty space where a human being once stood. Over the years, I've read thousands of missing person reports, and most of them, tragic as they are, follow a pattern, a crime, a motive, a suspect. But every so often, there are cases that break the pattern entirely, cases where logic stops working, where investigators are left with nothing but questions that refuse to be answered. These are the ones that stay with you, the ones that claw at the back of your mind long after the file's been closed. The first story I want to tell you tonight begins high above the tree line, where the wind howls like a living thing and the snow falls in sheets as thick as smoke. Mount Shasta, a jagged, snow-capped peak piercing the clouds of Northern California, has always been a place steeped in mystery. Ancient legends say it's sacred ground, the home of gods and hidden civilizations. But even the most skeptical climbers admit there's something strange about it, something that makes people disappear there more often than they should. One of those people was a man named Carl Landers. In May of 1999, Carl was 69 years old and stronger than most men half his age. He had finished the Boston Marathon, summited countless peaks, and was determined to cross one final mountain off his list. That mountain was Shasta. He wasn't inexperienced. He wasn't reckless. He was prepared for every possible danger, except, perhaps, the one that no one could explain. Then there's the second story, and it's darker, stranger, and more unsettling the deeper you go. It doesn't take place on a mountain, but on a lonely road stretching through the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest. It's about a young woman named Leah Roberts, a free-spirited soul searching for meaning after a lifetime of heartbreak. Leah wasn't running from anyone. She wasn't hiding. She told her friends she was going to the mountains to find herself. But somewhere along the way, she slipped off the map, and when investigators found her car, what they discovered inside made no sense at all. These aren't ghost stories. They aren't urban legends. They're real, documented cases with police reports, search teams, and families still waiting for answers. And yet, despite decades of searching, no one has been able to say what truly happened to Carl Landers or Leah Roberts. There are no bodies, no explanations, just an unsettling silence that's lasted for years. And that's what makes these stories so disturbing. They remind us that even in a world filled with technology and surveillance and endless information, people can still disappear without a trace. That a mountain can swallow a man in broad daylight with dozens of witnesses nearby. That a car can be found abandoned on a logging road, its windows covered with blankets, its owner's most prized possessions left behind. And yet no one can say why, or how, or where she went. Tonight, we're going to step into that silence. We're going to trace every step they took, from the final moments they were seen alive to the last clue left behind. And as we do, I want you to remember something. These people were real. They had families, friends, dreams. They had plans for tomorrow. And yet, for reasons no one understands, tomorrow never came. So sit back, turn down the lights, and listen closely. Because the stories you're about to hear, they aren't just about people who vanished. They're about the chilling truth that sometimes the world itself seems to erase them. Mount Shasta doesn't look like a place where people vanish. Its snow-blanketed slopes rise like a colossal cathedral into the Northern California sky, its jagged ridges catching the first light of dawn. On clear days, you can see it from over 100 miles away, a silent sentinel watching over the forests and valleys below. To the climbers who visit every year, Shasta is both a challenge and a promise. Steep, demanding, but not impossible. People hike it every summer. Thousands reach the summit without incident. And yet, every once in a while, the mountain takes someone, and it never gives them back. On the 21st of May 1999, That someone was Carl Herbert Landers. At 69 years old, Carl was anything but frail. He was wiry, disciplined, and relentlessly active. Friends described him as the kind of man who didn't just talk about doing things, he went out and did them. He ran every morning. He had the kind of stamina most men lose in their 40s. He had even completed the Boston Marathon in just over 5.5 hours, a feat most people never achieve. Climbing mountains had become something of a personal mission for him. He wanted to summit the highest point in every county in California, and for Siskiyou County, that meant Shasta. He tried once before, a year earlier, but had been turned back by altitude sickness and bad weather. This time, he was determined not to fail. He set out with two friends, Barry and Milt, both experienced climbers themselves. They planned their ascent carefully, spending the night in a small motel near the trailhead so they could start before dawn. At 4 a.m., they shouldered their packs, strapped on their gear, and began the long, slow climb. The first stretch was uneventful, a 4-mile hike through dense forest leading to the old Sierra Club cabin that marked the base of the main route. From there, the climb steepened. Deep snowdrifts slowed their progress, and by the time they reached the halfway point known as the 50/50 plateau, they decided to camp for the night rather than push on. That's when things started to go wrong. Carl hadn't been feeling well. He was taking a medication called Diamox to help with altitude sickness, but it seemed to be giving him severe diarrhea. It was bad enough that he had to leave his tent repeatedly in the middle of a freezing, gale-force night, and worse still, it meant he barely slept. By morning, he was dehydrated, exhausted, and worried he might hold his friends back. So Carl made a decision. He told Barry and Milt he was going to leave camp a little early and hike ahead to the next rest point, Lake Helen, just 650 feet higher up the slope. It wasn't a difficult stretch, especially for someone like him. The plan was simple. He'd start slow, get a head start, and they'd catch up soon after. They watched him go rust-brown coat zipped against the cold, crampons biting into the snow, and disappear around a curve in the trail. It was the last time anyone ever saw him. About 30 minutes later, Barry and Milt broke camp and followed. But not long into the climb, Barry began to feel sick and decided to turn back. Milt continued on alone, reaching Lake Helen easily. But when he got there, something felt off. Carl wasn't there. At first, Milt assumed he'd kept going, so he asked a few climbers at the site if they'd seen him. One man said someone matching Carl's description had passed through earlier, heading for the summit. But when Milt set off to catch up, he quickly realized the man they'd seen wasn't Carl. His clothes didn't match. He returned to Lake Helen and asked again. This time, no one reported seeing Carl at all. Still, he wasn't panicking. Maybe Carl had turned back. Maybe he'd gone down the mountain instead of up. Milt hiked back to camp, expecting to find his friend resting in the tent. But the tent was empty. Carl's gear was still there, his pack, his food untouched. And the man himself was nowhere to be found. As hours passed with no sign of Carl, Milt's concern turned to fear. He and Barry scoured the trail. They hiked back down the mountain. They checked the trailhead, the motel. Nothing. It was as if Carl had walked around that bend in the trail and ceased to exist. By the next morning, the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Department had launched a full-scale search and rescue operation. A veteran search coordinator named Grizz Adams led the effort. He'd handled over 400 searches in his career, but he'd never seen anything like this. They brought in helicopters equipped with infrared cameras. Search teams scoured the mountain on foot, on skis, even on horseback. Volunteers formed grid lines and swept every inch of the terrain. Professional climbers rappelled down crevasses and scaled steep chutes. Tracker dogs sniffed the snow for any trace of Carl's scent. They found nothing. No footprints, no dropped gear, no sign of a fall or an animal attack. No evidence he'd slipped into a hidden crevice, and in that area, there weren't any to fall into. It was a flat, open path. Dozens of climbers had passed through the same stretch that day. Not one of them had seen a thing. The search grew so large, they eventually had to move their command post from a school parking lot to the local airport. Still, it made no difference. The mountain held its silence. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Eventually, the search was called off. Carl Herbert Landers had vanished, not in a blizzard, not in a crevasse, not deep in the forest, but on a well-trodden, visible path in broad daylight, surrounded by other climbers. It was the second time in history someone had disappeared without a trace on Mount Shasta, but it was the first time anyone had vanished on such an easy stretch of trail. To this day, there's no evidence of what happened. Some locals say the mountains swallowed him. Others whisper about strange lights and ancient legends, stories of hidden civilizations and energy portals. Most believe he slipped, or collapsed, or wandered off disoriented. But those theories crumble under scrutiny. If he fell, why was there no body? If he wandered, why no tracks? If he collapsed, why no sign of disturbance in the snow? The truth is simpler and far more chilling. In less than 30 minutes, on a clear day, an experienced climber walked around a bend in the trail and was never seen again. Not all disappearances happen in the wilderness. Some unfold on highways, endless strips of asphalt cutting through lonely forests, where cell service drops, towns grow sparse, and miles pass without a single pair of headlights. That's where the second story begins. It's about a woman who wasn't running from danger, but chasing, meaning a woman who seemed to have everything under control until, one day, she slipped out of the world and never came back. Her name was Leah Toby Roberts. At first glance, Leah's life didn't look unusual. She was born and raised in Durham, North Carolina. A petite, athletic woman with a thick Southern accent and an easy smile. She was fluent in Spanish, loved soccer, and followed a strict vegetarian diet. She smoked occasionally, drank too much coffee, and wrote poetry in cafes. But beneath the surface, her life had been shaped by tragedy. When she was 17, her father was diagnosed with a rare lung disease. 3 years later, her mother died suddenly of a heart attack. Those two losses shattered Leah's world. She described herself as being born again after her mother's death, as if her old life had ended and a new one had begun. But that rebirth wasn't peaceful. It was restless, unsettled. It left her searching for something she couldn't quite name. Fate wasn't done with her yet. In 1998, Leah survived a horrific car accident when a truck pulled out in front of her. Her leg was shattered so badly, surgeons had to insert a metal rod so she could walk again. Once more, she described it as a rebirth, another reset, another chance to start over. Each trauma seemed to push her further from the ordinary world and deeper into a need for meaning. Around this time, Leah fell in love with the work of Jack Kerouac, particularly The Dharma Bums, a book about a man's spiritual journey into the wilds of the Pacific Northwest. She spoke often about wanting to follow in his footsteps, to retreat into the mountains, to write, to meditate, to live. After her father's death, she inherited some money and dropped out of college just months before graduating. She spent her days journaling, playing guitar, taking photos, and thinking deeply about life. To her family, it looked like she was drifting. To Leah, she was finally free. On the 9th of March 2000, Leah spoke with her sister Kara on the phone. They joked, laughed, and talked about plans including Leah's vague idea of heading west to the mountains. That same day, she promised a friend she'd help babysit the next afternoon. There was no hint of anything unusual, but just before 6 p.m., Leah loaded her belongings and her cat into her Jeep Cherokee, withdrew $3,000 in cash, and disappeared. At first, no one was worried. Leah had always been spontaneous, but when she missed the babysitting appointment and didn't return calls, alarm bells started ringing. 4 days later, Kara entered her apartment and found a note. It was folded, with a drawing of the Cheshire Cat on the front, smiling and fading, just as he does before vanishing. Inside was cash to cover a month's rent and bills, along with a letter telling her family not to worry, to have faith, and to remember Jack Kerouac. It was cryptic, poetic, and deeply unsettling. Using Leah's bank records, Kara traced her sister's path. On March 9th, Leah stayed in a hotel in Lebanon, Tennessee. Then she headed west along I-40, refueled in Oregon, and finally stopped just after midnight on March 13th at a gas station in Brooks, Oregon. Surveillance footage showed her in a wide-brimmed hat, healthy and calm, but repeatedly glancing out the window, as if checking for someone. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. 5 days later, joggers near Mount Baker in Washington noticed clothes hanging from trees along a remote logging road. Following the trail, they found Leah's Jeep at the bottom of a steep ravine just 100 miles from Desolation Peak, the destination she had always dreamed about. The crash scene raised more questions than answers. Investigators estimated the Jeep was traveling nearly 40 miles per hour when it left the road. It had flipped multiple times before slamming into an embankment, but there was no blood, no seatbelt damage, no broken glass from impact. It didn't look like anyone had been inside when it crashed. Stranger still, the interior told the story of someone living there, at least briefly. Pillows and blankets covered the windows, but Leah's most valuable possessions, her cash, checkbook, passport, guitar, CDs, were still inside. Even her mother's diamond engagement ring, which she cherished more than anything, was hidden beneath a floor mat. Her cat's carrier and food were there too, but the cat was gone. And there was something else, a movie ticket stub for American Beauty, purchased in nearby Bellingham. Investigators tracked Leah's last known movements and learned that she had been seen eating alone at a restaurant before the movie, chatting cheerfully with 2 men. One described her as upbeat and said she went to the theater alone. The other insisted she left with a man named Barry. His description was so detailed that police made a sketch, but no one else remembered seeing that man at all. Then, a week after the Jeep was discovered, police received a strange anonymous call. A man claimed his wife had seen Leah at a gas station in Everett, 60 miles south, acting disoriented, then abruptly hung up and never called again. It was the last possible sighting before the trail went cold. Kara refused to give up. She enlisted the help of a nonprofit specializing in cold cases, and even convinced police to preserve Leah's car and belongings. Years later, a new detective reopened the investigation. Forensics uncovered something alarming. The Jeep's starter relay cover had been removed, a trick that allows a vehicle to accelerate without anyone behind the wheel. It's a technique only a mechanic or someone with military training would know. The second man from the restaurant, he was a former military mechanic. Investigators also found fingerprints under the hood, but they didn't match his. Later, DNA testing far more advanced than in 2000 uncovered a man's genetic material on Leah's clothing. It didn't match the mechanic either. Whoever it belonged to has never been identified. And that's where the trail ends. No body, no confirmed sightings, no definitive answers. Leah's disappearance is a maze of contradictions. A crash that didn't kill, possessions left behind, clues that point in every direction and nowhere at once. Maybe she walked into the wilderness, injured and confused. Maybe she staged her disappearance. Maybe someone else was there that night. Someone who knows exactly what happened and has never spoken a word. But the truth is, no one knows. And like Carl Landers on Mount Shasta, Leah Roberts simply vanished not into thin air, but into something even more unsettling. The space between possibility and proof, where stories end and mysteries begin. There's something deeply unsettling about the way these stories end, or rather the way they don't. They just stop. A man disappears on a clear morning with dozens of people nearby. A young woman's car is found abandoned, her most treasured possessions untouched, as if she had simply evaporated. And in both cases, the trail goes cold, not because the answers don't exist, but because they're buried somewhere we can't reach. What haunts me most isn't the lack of evidence. It's the ordinary details that make their disappearances so terrifying. Carl Landers wasn't lost in a storm or swept into a crevasse. He was walking on a short, flat stretch of snow in broad daylight, on a mountain where hundreds of others were hiking that same day. Leah Roberts didn't vanish from a back alley or a dark parking lot. She disappeared on a public road, after being seen on surveillance cameras, after eating lunch with strangers, after buying a movie ticket. Their stories were unfolding just like anyone else's until they weren't. And that's what makes them feel so close to home. Because if someone like Carl, healthy, strong, experienced, can disappear in less than 30 minutes, what chance do the rest of us have? If someone like Leah, intelligent, independent, resourceful, can vanish with her life laid out in bank records, gas receipts, and security footage. How many of us could simply step off the edge of the map without anyone ever knowing how or why? It's easy to blame the wilderness, to say that the mountains swallowed Carl, or that the forest took Leah. But the truth is, people vanish from everywhere, from cities, from highways, from their own homes. And the terrifying part is that sometimes, despite the best technology, the best investigators, the most determined families, the answers stay hidden forever. Maybe Carl slipped into some hidden crevice and was buried by the snow, though no one's ever found so much as a boot print. Maybe Leah staged the crash to start a new life, though the DNA on her clothes suggests someone else was involved. Maybe both were victims of something darker, something no one's been able to piece together. Or maybe the truth is stranger than any theory we've come up with. We all like to believe we're in control, that we can explain everything if we just gather enough evidence. But these stories are a brutal reminder that control is an illusion. The world is vast, unpredictable, and sometimes mercilessly silent. And within that silence, people can and do disappear. For the families left behind, that silence is the hardest part. There's no closure, no grave to visit, no answers to cling to. Just empty space where a person once was. Kara still wonders what happened to her sister every single day. Friends of Carl still scan the slopes of Mount Shasta when they hike, half expecting to see a flash of brown fabric in the rocks. They probably always will. Maybe that's why these stories linger with us, because they speak to a primal fear we all carry, the fear of being erased, of walking out the door one morning and never walking back in, of leaving behind a life full of people who will never know what happened to us. And maybe that's why we can't stop talking about them, because deep down, we hope that by remembering their names, by telling their stories again and again, we might somehow pull them a little closer. Maybe someone watching this will recognize a detail, remember a face, connect a dot no one else has. Maybe, even after all these years, someone will finally find a clue. Until then, their stories remain open, frozen in time, unanswered, unresolved. Two people, two disappearances, two haunting reminders that sometimes the scariest thing isn't what we see, it's what's missing. So now I have to ask you, what do you think happened? Did Carl wander into some hidden danger no one's ever found? Did Leah trust the wrong person on her road to self-discovery? Or is there another explanation we haven't even considered yet? Let me know what you believe in the comments. And if you've ever encountered a case like this one that refuses to let go of you, share it. Because the more we talk about these stories, the harder they are to forget. And sometimes, remembering is the only way to make sure they aren't gone forever.